Hello and welcome back to the Talking Leadership TV podcast series. Thank you for joining us again. Our guest today is Dr. Adrian McCallum. Adrian served for almost 20 years across all three arms of the Australian Defence Force in multiple operational, technical and leadership roles. He's then pursued a field research career that's taken him around the world. He currently leverages his experiences to help advance the academic and industry partnerships that he's involved with across science, engineering and defence. He brings a unique combination of technical, operational and leadership skills. He's also passionate about empowering and mentoring the next generation of engineers, scientists and leaders. Adrian's been a previous contributor to this podcast, and I can't thank him enough for having a chat with me today around the issue of reflective leadership practice. But as always, enough from me. I'll hand over to our guest today, Adrian McCallum. Adrian, thank you for joining me again on the podcast, mate. How are you?
Eric, very well. Nice to see you. Thanks very much for having me again.
Mate, it's good that you've come back to have a chat with me, and we talked offline late last year and early this year around a particular topic to have a chat about. And for me, moving the podcast into some new key areas of discussion that have come out from the conversations I've had in the lead up to this. One of them is, what does it mean to be a reflective leader practitioner? And that to me has multiple compartments. And for the purposes of this discussion and this podcast, my reaching out to you was that you have a keen interest in reflective practice, and I might get you to explain why that is in a second. But to start with, in broad terms, how do you define for yourself what reflective practice is? And then can you make that link in your mind to how you think that incorporates itself with leaders, or at least the leaders that you've met?
Sure. So, look, as you and I have discussed here and there over the years, for better or worse, I spent a lot of time thinking about how to be, an effective leader, however we might define that, depending on the circles we're operating in. And most of my reading and reflection leads me back to the point that to be an effective leader or influencer in any group, regardless of the size, you need to understand yourself first and foremost, and you need to be, the current catchword, of course, is authentic. You need to completely understand your motivations for doing what you're doing. You need to be transparent about that. And you can only do that by the word we use, reflection, which simply is just giving yourself time to think about who you are, what you're doing, how you're doing it, what you're thinking when you're doing it, and how that understanding of self can hopefully translate to effective leadership, communication with, relationship establishing with others to help them and you move in the same direction. So, as you said in your preamble, there's a lot we can unpack here. But I've waffled on a little bit there, but that's essentially my encapsulation of reflective practice and its application towards leadership.
Sure, and that's a good starting point. I would hazard a guess here that this topic, and as this discussion plays out with yourself and other guests on, pardon the pun here, but reflecting on their own practice and thinking about that and having a chat about it, that there's going to be some similarities, but the degree to which you apply one element of reflective practice or another, I think, is situational, potentially context based. So for those that are watching, and this will be in the podcast introduction, that your role as a leader in the higher education university space would probably throw up its own challenges. I don't think I've found a world-breaking insight by saying that, but each of the worlds that we inhabit in terms of work will throw some things up that are challenges for us, or at least kick in that part of our grey matter that help us think about what we've done or assess what we've done and think about what could have been done better. My curiosity here in this conversation with you is, can you think of a time, and you don't need to use names, obviously, but an event or a situation that kicked in that thinking post the event that you went, oh shit, I need to reflect on this, or I need to assess where my thinking was at. Can you share something like that with me?
Sure. Yeah. Look, I think I was involved in, a large amount of change management that occurred institutionally last year, and a lot of change was initiated and pushed through in a short period of time. And as you'd understand, people typically are averse to change, especially if it occurs over a short period of time, and especially if the conception is, or the perception is, that consultation may not have been as optimum or as free flowing or as two-way as desired. So that certainly got amber lights flashing, I suppose, about how people I work with, how institutions, how workplaces more generally um, manage change. And we hear about change management all the time, and keywords to put on your resume, blah blah blah, etc. But this was perhaps the first time on a broader scale where the implications of not doing change management well were apparent. And what is apparent is that it comes back to leadership, of course, that leadership is based on relationships, which is based on communication of many forms, which establishes trust essentially between leaders and teams and within teams, etc. And if that trust is jeopardized by poor change management, for many of those reasons I discussed before, then we're human beings. It can take time for that trust to be rebuilt, and by time I don't mean a week or a month. It could be years, dare I say it, even decades institutionally. And I'm sure there are examples in the corporate world and beyond, and probably from politics as well, where once that trust between the leader or leaders and the people, the team, is jeopardized or fractured, even to a smaller extent, then it just takes time for those relationships to rebuild and for that trust to be reestablished.
In that vein, and maybe not just using the example which you just cited, which thanks for sharing with us. Do you make time to reflect? Like, do you have some time squirreled away each week? Is it a formal thing for you, or do you approach it on an ad hoc basis? And I'll give you some rationale for asking that question. Is I'm not 100% sure the way, and I'm talking here from a leader perspective, that people in leadership spaces often are thinking about reflection in a very formal, considered way, and will engage with that practice when and if it's required, and when and if the outcome of something is very good or very bad. Like it seems to me extremes pull you into that headspace. So, one, I guess I'll restate the question if I can, if you'll indulge me, Adrian. Is one, is it a formal or informal process for you? And do you agree or disagree that it's at those extremes when that process is triggered in your, at least your thinking?
Sure. So for me, it's certainly both formal and informal, and I can give examples shortly. And to your second part of that question, I think my perspective is that more broadly, as you say, it's the extremes that trigger the need to self-reflect or debrief or mop up after an event went awry or whatever it might be. So that might force reflection, but I don't believe that's optimal. I think that some level of reflection is always useful after any interaction. After my meeting with you, I might jot down some notes. When I meet with a client or with a student, whoever it might be, I think it's useful to capture um, the actions, of course, from that meeting, but perhaps the thoughts and the emotions that you feel from those interactions and why that might be occurring and what that might tell you about yourself for the future and future interactions for you with others that you deal with. So formal and informal. It's in my diary every week to take time to reflect, but most of the time I don't have time to do that and I move it on. So invariably, I reflect informally, largely perhaps of an evening when I go for a run or when I'm, away from the busyness of our work life. And I'm sure many of your guests and your listeners, your viewers would perhaps share that our work lives are so very busy. And this is why I don't want to branch into this prematurely, but we might be able to discuss this later. This is why I'm bringing on expedition-based journeys of discovery for students at this institution, because young adults, I've got a couple at home, trying to work out how they can best be themselves and best spend their lives, especially when they're carrying, phones around in their pockets 24/7 that are buzzing and doing all sorts of things. It's very hard for us as people, and especially youth, to find the bandwidth in our lives to actually to accurately or effectively reflect. We might put it in our diary, and you can say, yes, I effectively reflected today, I jotted down some notes. But do we ever let ourselves get to the state of non-distraction? And this is where words like mindfulness and prayer and meditation and other mechanisms to dislocate ourselves from the busy world perhaps are effective, because we need to think of ways to truly and effectively reflect. Otherwise, we're going through the motions, but perhaps not benefiting particularly from that time.
Disconnecting from distraction, I think, is inherently difficult to do at the best of times. And when you put what you just said in the context of very busy leaders, I'm thinking, CEOs in the corporate and CEOs in the not-for-profit space, that there are a lot of pressures on people's time. And it kind of stands to reason, I guess, in the current era. And if people disagree with what I'm going to say next, then please reach out and tell me why you disagree. But I think the nature of how busy we are, we only sort of go down that track of reflection when you get the big win or the big loss. And it's those in between bits that you're talking about, when you might be exercising or doing something that is completely unrelated to your leadership position, that you start thinking. I myself, I use friends and trusted confidants to talk about what issues I've got and reflect with them and say, look, I need to tell you about some things and how that made me feel. May not use the words in that way, but I sort of get a chance to put a brain dump out there and say, I think this is where this was coming from, and the outcome could have been different if X, Y, Z. And I tend to use others as a sounding board to help with my own reflection, because I keep thinking that, and this is a personal view, and I have no literature to back me here, and this conversation is not about a research perspective on this, but for me, solo reflection, there's an inherent bias there, and at times you're not going to be able to pick that out. And when you're talking to, let's say, a brother or sister or a close friend, they're going to be that sounding board. And if you're, pardon the expression, talking shit, they will call you out on the BS very quickly and
Yeah.
get you to reassess where you're coming from and maybe ask some questions that you may not have. And that's easy for me to say in some context where maybe your social circles aren't that big. Then you've got to potentially find other ways, because I would assume the pressure will build up to the degree that if you're not thinking about how some things are done, and this isn't talking, and I'm not talking about the quality of the level of reflection, but just that you engage in it at some level allows for some closure of some things, perhaps. And I've never asked this in these podcasts, but do you reflect to get an outcome that you're satisfied with to give you some closure, or do you do it to help learn and then test it at another time? I've never asked, but do we reflect to get closure on something, or do we reflect to try and learn from that event, or some combination of the two?
Yeah, look, from my personal perspective, it would probably be a combination of the two. I might go out for a run, emptying the brain, waiting to see what pops into it. And some of those things that pop in might be solutions to things that have been swirling around in my subconscious. But some of them, of course, would be greenfield thoughts that are, how about this or how about that? So I like to think that we can help in, closing the stressors of the day, perhaps through that reflective process, but also open up opportunities of who we might speak to, or what we might do next, or what we might chase up. So I think it can be both, but of course that would be a personal matter.
So let me ask you this, Adrian. Do you think, or do you believe that reflective practice is a solo endeavor, or should you include others in that process?
Look, I think it should very much be both. You know, going back to what I said at the very start, I don't think you can lead as optimally as you could. You can still lead effectively, probably without some level of self-reflection. But I think for optimal leadership, you need to understand self, and to understand self, you need to self-reflect, introspect and think about, who is Adrian McCallum and why am I doing this and what do I want to achieve and how am I going to best convey that and what emotions are typical when I do that, and I need to acknowledge that and work out, is that a good thing or a bad thing? If it's a bad thing, how can I ameliorate that and perhaps communicate in a different way to get a different outcome? So I think self is essential, but if you're with a team, small team, big team, I certainly, completely agree that the group must be with you. You must spend that time to, share, chew the fat, establish those relationships, and then work out where you want to go together and how you're going to get there together. I think that is absolutely necessary. And as I said, I demonstrated an example relatively recently where perhaps it didn't go as well as it could have. So, you know, keeping everyone on the same page, again, comes back to communication, is key.
Fully agree with that. One thing I'd ask around reflective practice, and this was brought up in a conversation, not to do with this podcast, but around the issue of mentoring. And we all have, I guess, formal and informal mentors, whether we're aware of that or not. The informal ones tend to be, in my experience, the most numerous. Chasing formal mentors is a process in itself, but have you used your reflective practice in that context by talking to mentors that you've had to test some of your thinking? And the reason for me asking that is part of that reflective process, at least in my experience, is you sometimes come up with questions or issues that you don't know necessarily how to deal with, and having someone as a sounding board is quite a unique position if you've got the good fortune to have someone in your life to do that. So, have you ever reflected with a mentor, or at least part of that reflection? Go, hey, I've been thinking about this. What's your thought? Have you used that approach, Adrian?
Look, I have used it on occasion, not always necessarily with my historical or typical mentors, but in my particular circumstance, my wife is a valuable mentor, a valuable sounding board, because she manages a business. She's also a scientist, a veterinary surgeon. So she manages many day-to-day things that I grapple with as well. So she's probably always my first port of call. And you mentioned earlier that, hopefully we all have mentors. My concern is that many of us perhaps don't, and this again is the sort of conversation I have with my students, saying you don't have to do this alone. The world is about relationships and about the networks you can forge. People generally are happy to assist. So we need to inculcate that expectation and those actions at an early age. I think as our children are transitioning through youth to become adults, they of course are finding their way in the world, and I think we need to help them understand that having mentors is a valuable process. We watch our parents as we grow up. They mentor us, of course. We learn much of what we do through them. As we leave the nest, we need to continue that process. It's completely natural. We just need to let our children and the youth of our society understand that that's a positive and a useful thing to do.
Yeah, well, we couldn't agree more. In my circumstance, I have a lot of cousins, mostly male cousins, and they're a lot older than my two sons, and I encourage them quite a bit to reach out to their cousins, but second cousins. They look at them more as uncles because of the age difference, but so look, go and chat to XYZ cousin, have a chat, um, put your thoughts out there in a very different way to the conversation that you might have with dad. And why I do that is I understand that in a familial context, your kids and you have a strong relationship, but there's certain things kids won't say or ask their mum and dad as much as
Yeah.
you might encourage them to do that. And having other people in their lives that might act as mentors or role models is a good and healthy thing as well. And it's a good practice and training ground for how you communicate in the world when you get to the world of work, because there are some good people in every organization that are prepared to be mentors or sit down and have a chin wag about something. Some won't, and that's fine. There's no judgment there, but you have to be prepared to at least ask the question. And that comes to those things that you mentioned earlier in this chat around being able to communicate, being able to hold a conversation, and essentially bridging that gap to ask for help or advice means you've got to take a risk,
Yeah.
and that's I think part of that process. And I think in some ways that links to reflection, because you can always learn from other people, as in, this is my view of things. And if we subscribe to the theory of being a lifelong learner, then I would suggest what you've been talking about, and being a reflective practitioner in whatever field you are, particularly in the leadership space, is important, because it's only going to make you a better operator. I don't think there'd be any literature, again, I'm happy to be corrected on this, that being reflective is a negative thing. In fact, it's quite a positive thing. There are a lot of people out there, and you only need to go on LinkedIn to find us, that make a very good living on how to teach people how to be reflective and introspective and self-reflective, and being able to ask yourself some tough questions. And I think fundamentally letting go of some of your ego to take some of the shots that come, and I'm talking, it's not always negative. Reflections don't always have to be negative, but I think sometimes hearing the brutal truth about something is a learning experience in itself. And yes, it's difficult to hear, but I think it's part of the process. I really like the connection with family, helps expand my thinking in that regard, Adrian. So let me as a segue into the final part of the chat here, what tips or tricks could you give to someone that's listening or watching this around setting your own framework up to be reflective? What's some simple things people can do?
Look, as you were discussing mentoring, Eric, I was just thinking, the last couple of decades I've been involved in many mentoring schemes, and they're all set up for the best reasons, because, as we've just discussed, it's valuable. But many of them fall over because one thing, and that's a lack of time. Mentors, mentees set out to make it happen, but they run out of time in their calendar. So, time is the worst enemy for reflection. So my advice and my experience is that self-discipline is key. Self-management is key. Saying no is key. Even though I've already told you that I regularly jeopardize my forecast reflective time in my diary, I still acknowledge the need to remove myself from my situation to try and garner an objective perspective, because we teach our first year engineers, that's the only way you can solve a problem, is to get that objective perspective, to go broad and get different perspectives. So I think as individuals, we need to acknowledge that time, whether it's going for a run or walking in the park or lunch outside, whatever it is, we need to extract ourselves from the 24/7 that's driven by these sort of things, and make that time, whether it's formal. As I said earlier, I dislike form because you just may not be in a reflective mood when your calendar reminder says time to reflect. So I think you just need to build in informal opportunities through your day. It might be while you're commuting. It might be, as I said, exercising or other things. But I think, at least in my experience, informal reflection is perhaps more valuable, because I need to give my space first and foremost for that to occur. And then, as we said, solutions to problems may identify, but also, new perspectives may arise. So I think it's finding the time in your lives to make that happen, which is key.
Oh, I appreciate that response, and your students are lucky to have you as a lecturer, mate. This is good stuff, and I think a personal view only, that exposing young minds to this kind of thinking is a great way to give them another tool in the toolkit to engage with the world of work, and not necessarily in the lead up to leadership roles, but at some point you may be asked to be a leader, or you might seek leadership roles. And so having the ability to reflect and to learn in those roles is a key thing. And being exposed to the idea of being reflective while you're young and learning in whatever form, whether it's university or TAFE or whatever the pathway you choose to enrich your thinking is, I think, a positive thing. So, Mr. Adrian McCallum, thank you again for your time, sir. This has been great.
Thank you, Eric. Always a pleasure. Look after yourself.
You too, mate. For those listening, this has been the Talking Leadership TV podcast series. Thank you for joining us again. As always, have a great day, rest of your week, and we'll catch you on the next episode of the podcast.